Good evening, listeners. You have tuned in to WWT radio station with me, Priscilla Phantom, for my show, The Phantom Myth. We are the only radio show on this small isle that explores the unknown and investigates the supernatural to ease your worries. Now, unfortunately today, I have some rather terrifying news regarding Edith Horn, or Beatrix, as she has taken to calling herself. She was sighted by dozens of people today, wandering down the high street in a long green dress and swinging about a bloodied crowbar. She was reportedly singing a song that onlookers have only really described as creepy. And she almost hit a police officer. The police officer was attempting to talk her into going into custody peacefully. Instead, she reportedly laughed and ran off. Listeners, nobody tried to confront her, which was the right thing to do. She may seem small, but she's considered armed and extremely dangerous. The police will apprehend her, and we, as citizens, need to consider our safety as our number one concern. Now, for this episode, I shall be reading a letter from Henry Knights, who was actually in the year above me in high school. Henry has written in to tell us about his experiences with sirens. Dear Miss Phantom, I'm writing to tell you about something that happened. I'm sure you've heard of the Melody, the boat that crashed off the east coast 2 years ago. It's my brother's ship, and I was aboard that night. The reports are right in saying that we had been drinking, and probably right when they say we were foolish. But my brother was a fantastic captain, and it's not true that he was incompetent. Since that day, I've had people tell me that I was high, or that I'm delusional, that I imagine things, or maybe I was a little bit more drunk than I realised. But I know the truth, and I need to tell it. It was the day before my wedding, and I was nervous, but I did what any husband-to-be does the night before they get married. I drowned my nerves with booze. I had never been excited by the idea of having a big bachelor party, so instead I went to my local pub, the Cloak and Dagger, with my mate, Lewis, to watch football. I remember telling him I would only have 2 drinks and then get home around 10 because I obviously needed to be up early in the morning. He just smiled at me in that knowing, smarmy way he used to. He knew I was lying to myself, but he said nothing and got us our first drinks. I always pretended to hate it when he did that. Now, as you can imagine, 2 drinks turned into the 3, and 3 drinks became 4, and 5, and 6, and you get the picture. Around 9, my brother, Leonard, phoned to tell us that he was free to hang out. I asked what he'd been doing all day, and he told us that somebody had rented out his boat for a party. I told him to meet us in the pub, but Lewis had overheard the conversation and suggested hanging out on the boat. I was drunk. I was definitely drunk by then, and I had reached the point where any sense I had, ever had, just went out the window. Hanging out on the boat, however, at the time, didn't seem like a good idea. It seemed like an incredible one. My brother agreed to it, stipulating only that if he was going to drink, then he wouldn't take the boat out. And we agreed. On the way to the harbour, we stopped off at the little off-licence on the corner of Hemlock Hill and Hades Way and picked up a box of beer and a packet of cigarettes, although neither of us thought to buy a lighter to go with it. When we got there, my brother was in high spirits. He immediately informed us that he'd made 500 quid. I eyed his rust bucket boat that he had bought impulsively from a police auction with the money that Grandma had left him in her will, and politely asked him, "Really?" He told me that the couple had been desperate to book a boat for their son's 18th, as the last one had pulled out last minute. We talked for a bit and drank a few more beers. My brother had only had a few when I mentioned about taking the boat out, and he told me no, and I dropped the idea. Lewis, however, did not. We drank some more and listened to some awful music that my brother liked, and we danced, if you can call it that. I'm clumsy when I'm sober, but for some reason when I'm drunk, I think I'm the greatest dancer to ever live. Watching video clips of myself on my mate's Instagram the next morning is usually quite disillusioning. Anyway, after my brother had had a few more drinks, around the time I managed to light a cigarette from the toaster, Lewis brought up the idea about taking the boat out again. "Just around the harbour," he promised. My brother, of course, told him no. But Lewis did not relent, and to be honest, I didn't help matters. Lewis told him to lighten up and pointed out that people probably thought it would have been the continuation from the party earlier. Nobody would have any reason to think the captain would have been drinking. I told him that I thought we would be fine. It was night after all, and as long as he didn't crash it, it should be okay. In the end, he caved. We went around the harbour once, and it was okay. We were okay. We were all still happy, laughing as we went about. After that short trip, my brother got cocky. I guess that he thought he had to prove to himself that if he could do that safely, he could do anything. Lewis wanted to go out into the open sea, and my brother changed tune completely. We were all very drunk, and it seemed like such a good idea at the time, so I didn't stop them. We went out, and the mist rolled in, and our high spirits died almost immediately. As I'm sure you know, the island has a lighthouse to guide us back, and my brother assured us that he had driven in conditions much worse than this, so we kept going. I don't really know why we kept going. We never acknowledged it to one another, but I think we all felt that sinking feeling in our guts. Maybe we had heard the call then, even before we had realised it. All I knew was that the further we went out, the more distant seemed the hope that we would ever get home safely. The only light was coming from the lighthouse, or what I assumed was the lighthouse. Through the fog, all I could see was a patch of white, pale mist as it passed by. I shivered and wrapped my arms around myself. It began to feel as if the cold air were tendrils wrapping around us. We were silent, huddled in this small boat, the waves lapping gently either side and throwing up a thin layer of sea foam, which felt like pinpricks of ice against my cold skin. Some part of my mind told me to go back, to go home, to go get into my pyjamas and go to bed with a hot water bottle. It sounded so nice, so perfect, and somehow so utterly impossible. I had to go further. We had to go further. and then we heard it. I'm not entirely sure the noise came from around us. It sounded as if it echoed inside my head. But I looked at Lewis and at my brother, Leonard, and I saw their eyes widen, and inside their pupils was a faint green glimmer of light. Then their expressions went slack, emotionless. But that green light never left. I imagine I looked much the same as they did. People were wrong when they said it was the Siren Song. It's not a song. It has no rhythm or melody. It's a sharp sound, shrill and monstrous to our ears. It is not a song, but simply a call. We went towards it. I didn't want to go, but it never crossed my mind to do anything else. We had no will, nothing to fight it, no thought of contradict this invitation to slaughter. The memory is all still so clear to me. Looking back on it, I wish I had done something else, anything else. But it just never occurred to me that there was any other path that we could have taken, but further into the dark and the mist and closer to whoever, whatever, was calling us. The darkness went on forever, and the call got louder and louder, and my mind ached. The pressure in my head grew until I felt like I would explode, and then that's when we saw them, peering out from the fog. 100 eyes watched through a film of red, and 1,000,000 teeth, sharpened and hungry, glistening in what little light the boat provided. I was certain then that we were all going to die, and I have never been so scared. But at the same time, I felt at peace, as if I knew that whatever would happen, and there was nothing I could do to avoid it. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't fight. Still, it did not occur to me that I could do anything else. At that point, I may not have been able to save myself or my brother or my best friend, but I could have gone out kicking and screaming. But I didn't. Even as these things reached up and over the side of the boat, we stood by and watched in abject horror, taking in the rows upon rows of knife-like teeth, their big red eyes, and the pale scales that covered their faces. A hand took hold of Lewis's ankle, and as he slid into the sea, I saw the moment the spell broke. His face was placid and emotionless, and then his eyes widened as if he had just woken up. A short scream rose up before he was dragged down. The water clouded with red, and when Lewis's body bobbed back up to the surface, he wasn't screaming or fighting anymore. He didn't move at all. Still, as my brother and I stood and watched, so completely aware that the same fate would claim us, we did nothing. No other course of action ever struck me but to watch and to wait and to bleed and to die. My brother was next. The hand wrapped around his leg and pulled him forward. My brother was standing further back than Lewis, so he did not smoothly slip into the water, but he was yanked to the floor of the boat. I watched his head hit the floor and his eyes go wide much the same way as Lewis's had. He pulled his leg free from the siren's grip, and I wished I could help him, but I didn't. When I was young, I watched a nature documentary where a mother duck was taking her ducklings out of the nest for the first time. In the show, a mink caught one of the ducklings and carried it off. I remember asking my mum and dad why nobody was doing anything. They explained to me that nature could be brutal, but to keep our delicate ecosystem in balance, we should not interfere. I wanted more than anything to reach into that TV, to take the poor little duckling from the mink and to give him back to his mother. But I couldn't. The time to do it had disappeared into the past, and all I saw was the imprint of that moment. That's how I felt as I watched my brother grab an oar, one of the ones he kept on board in case the engine failed, and proceeded to swing it wildly in the direction of those creatures. I could do nothing. I was too distant. I watched him, a tranquil expression plastered over my face as one of the creatures caught the oar and pulled forward, as my brother lost his balance and as he fell in. I noticed they did not bite him or eat him. I think I assumed that they would. After all, why kill if not for food? I was next. I felt fingers around my ankle, and I slipped into the cold, cold water, and I gasped. Before me was a face, far from a human face, but certainly not one of any sea creature I knew of. Its scales from its bald head glinted in the light. Its pupils were round, and its irises were dark, almost human, but clouded with a thin layer of red. It smiled a wide smile, and I could see every sharp tooth of this creature. 3 rows, and I felt calm. Maybe it was the cold setting in, maybe I was in shock, or maybe I had resigned myself to what was to come. As I was dragged down in the dark, I panicked and tried to scream, and with dismay and regret I watched as the last of my oxygen float up, out of my grasp, and whatever dismal light the boat provided vanished under the black water. It got quite hazy after that. I kicked and flailed, but to no avail. The next thing I remember is the sound of shouting, panic, chaos, a sharp pain in my chest, and the overwhelming urge to vomit. When I did throw up, however, all that came out was salty water and booze. The chaos around me continued after that, but the tone seemed to have changed. They asked me what happened, and I told them I didn't remember. They asked where my brother and Lewis were. I told them I didn't remember. What else could I say? Certainly not the truth. Apparently people from the pub heard our conversation, with my brother's boat missing from the harbour, and after I was found the way I was, half drowned and suffering with pneumonia, and that put me in hospital for a week, people, I think, just assumed the obvious. A week later, a fisherman found my brother's boat marooned on the rocks near Ammonite Cove. They found my brother's blood and the bottles of beer, and everyone was certain of what had happened. I let them believe it. That was until a month ago when I got drunk in the pub and someone asked what happened, and I told them. I told them everything. The drinking, the call, the horrible creature and their scaled faces and their knife-like teeth. I told them how we were terrified but enraptured. How we stood awaiting our deaths as one by one we were dragged into the ocean by these creatures. I don't think he believed me, but most people on this island have heard a version of my story, so I thought I might as well write this letter and tell you my version of the truth, even if no one believes me. I sometimes find myself drawn to Ammonite Cove, to sit and to watch the waves, to think of what I saw that night and to wonder what else might that dark water be hiding beneath its surface. Thank you for indulging my truth, Miss Phantom, even if you don't believe it. First of all, I want to say that I am sorry for your loss. It must be weighing very heavily on you. You know very well that I don't believe in ghosts or ghouls or paranormal creatures of any kind, and that includes sirens. I think maybe part of the reason you wrote to me was because you knew I would tell you that these sirens don't exist. These sirens are very possibly demons of your own creation to make sense of the night that you can't bear to think about. Also, this isn't entirely relevant, but I want to point out that according to Greek mythology, rather than popular belief, sirens were thought to have been half woman, half bird. The half woman, half fish that you speak of is closer to the description of mermaids. Although most stories regard mermaids to be benevolent. Around the 1800s, more stories arose of women who drowned, and their ghosts would lure men in to die in the same manner that they did. These even tell of beautiful women who sang sweetly, unlike the creatures in your story. In Irish myth, the male mermaid is said to be more fish than man, grotesquely ugly and covered in scales. It is said that these hideous things were so lonely and bitter that would take revenge on sailors to drag them under the waves and imprison their souls. Your story seems to combine different stories from different places, yet does not fit perfectly with either, which I find quite interesting. I seem to have gotten quite far off topic. Mr. Knights, I do believe that this is all a figment of your imagination, but this must have been a very traumatic time for you, and I cannot blame you for creating this story to bury the painful, true memory of that night. You lost 2 people very close to you, and I hope that you know that it's not your fault. You survived, and that's good. I would urge you to find somebody to talk about this. Listeners, you are not safe. Beatrix proved that today. So I urge you all to be careful. Check your back seat before driving. Lock your doors. And if you see something strange, call for help. Sleep well listeners.
The voice of Priscilla Phantom is Lynsey Evans. This podcast was written, produced and edited by Sasha K Williams. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Phantom Myth. I hope you enjoyed it. And don't worry, you probably did imagine that creepy noise earlier. You're fine. Probably. Have an okay day. Also, if you do enjoy this episode, you can donate to our PayPal page just to help us keep making the podcast. I can no longer fit any episodes on Podbean, and I've decided just to leave the ones on there that are already on there. And I'm not going to upgrade yet. I might do in the future. Who knows? If you do donate £1 or more, I'll thank you at the end of the next show. Again, I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll hear from us in 2 weeks with episode 8, Bright Lights. Thank you so much.